Okay, let's go around and introduce yourselves, and let's start with Holly. And sorry. Oh, yeah, we got a few. Okay, so we're just welcome everybody. We're just starting introductions. Holly, if you could go first, I'll go Holly, Carol, and then Jonas, and I'll go last. Thanks.
Oh, hi everyone. My name's Holly Schofield. I write science fiction with some fantasy short stories only. And I've been doing it about 7 or 8 years, and my grammar is absolutely terrible. Growing up as a child in the 60s, grammar was not taught. It was completely out of fashion. So I had, basically learned my grammar from day one, the minute I started writing, and it's not easy. I've got about 84 short stories published in places like Analog and Escape Pod. And you can find them on my website at hollyschofield.wordpress.com.
Cool. All right, Carol.
I'm Carol Parchewsky. I'm a fiction writer based in Calgary, Alberta. And I am the current past president of the Writers Guild of Alberta. And so I'll put a plug out for the Writers Guild of Alberta. We're the largest provincial writers guild in Canada. And we have our AGM coming up next month. And we're looking for board members. So if you're interested, please contact. And I recently graduated with my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Queen's University of Charlotte. And my background is mechanical engineering. I have a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. Most recently, I was fiction co-editor of QU Literary Magazine. I have poetry and paintings published. And for me, with grammar, it becomes with some of the things you get between the American and Canadian. And you're between the two languages, and which way do you go sometimes. But grammar is something that in engineering isn't that much of a focus. In writing, it's very much a focus.
Okay,
nice
thank
to
you.
See everyone today.
All right, Jonas, thank you.
I'm Jonas Saul. I've written over 30 thrillers. I'm actually be releasing my 40th novel this year, and I just write thrillers. I'm currently traveling through Greece and writing my thrillers.
Awesome. Okay, and I'm Talena Winters. I live in northern Alberta near Peace River, and I have been publishing since 2015, and I have been editing professionally for 2 years now. And before that, I was a songwriter, but my interest in grammar has been abiding ever since I was small. So I used to be, unfortunately, one of those grammar Nazis, and I've relaxed a little now, but I really love editing. It's really, really rewarding. Right now, I am currently writing a young adult fantasy series called, you can't see that. Okay, there we go. The Rise of the Grigori. This is book 1, The Undine's Tear. And I also write romantic contemporary fiction. All right, so first of all, knowing the rules. So Holly, I love that you admitted that you're not so great at grammar. So maybe we'll start with you on this one. So if someone has grammar or spelling or other issues like that they're not super solid on, what should they use to help them? And what are some go-to tools that you use when you need to check something?
I have a whole range of things that I use. Number one is probably reading the manuscript aloud, because you can catch yourself that way and you don't need to know the reason why it sounds wrong, just that it sounds wrong. So that would be number one. Number two would be going to my critique partners, critique buddies, critique groups, whatever sort of network you have. And some of them will not mind doing line edits, some of them will. And you develop a relationship and return the favor and so on, because it's surprisingly easy to find grammar mistakes in other people's work, but not necessarily in your own. And also I do use a bunch of websites. Let's see. The best one is probably Grammar Girl, which is quickanddirtytips.com/Grammar Girl. And you just put in a few words or sentences, and it'll tell you what's wrong, and it is pretty good. It's much better than Word or any of those sort of grammar checkers. Gingersoftware.com is another one. And I even use capitalizemytitle.com, which tells you how to capitalize titles, but it also will correct grammar and show you punctuation as well, although it's sometimes wrong there, maybe. And really, it's just a matter of going over it and over it and over it and getting other eyeballs on it in addition to your own.
Those are excellent ideas. Carol, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. In addition to what Holly said, because I use the website, reading it aloud, I also will let my computer read it aloud to me. And after you listen for a while, you get used to the automated robotic voice sound, and I start to pick things out of my manuscript. I also like Strunk and White, Elements of Style. I have from one of my copy editing classes, I have a Rules for Writers, a nice thick book that I consult. I also have The Magic of Fiction that I like to look up for fiction conventions. And it's definitely reading aloud is really important.
Excellent.
Because with my students, I have them read aloud their work, and they start inserting words that aren't in the written word. And so they need to add some words, they need to change some words.
That's a fantastic idea to do that, reading aloud. Okay, Jonas?
You know what? A lot of points have been hit on that were so solid. Many of those websites Holly mentioned, and Carol has some great ideas. One I just have to echo was Grammar Girl. I've learned so much from her, and she's got several books on Amazon. You can buy, bookstore, whatever. I bought these books and memorized them, and they are incredible tools. Another one is Benjamin Dreyer's English. He's the copy chief at Random House, and he actually tells you how it works and how things are published and how the big five publish English. This guide is an incredible style guide. I refer to that guide and Grammar Girl much more than I ever go to the Chicago Manual of Style. Where the Chicago Manual of Style is the Bible, these people, Grammar Girl and Dreyer's English, are masters at everything. Final point I want to make on this topic is something Carol brought up, and it's so important that writers understand the succinct difference between American and Canadian English. It is an incredible difference. There's 4,000 or 5,000 differences in our languages from toward and towards. With an S is Canadian, without the S is American. There are so many differences, and I do recommend you writing in American English if you want to have a broad readership. It's just so important. I only edit in American English. I don't do Canadian or AP style. Everything to the use of their ellipsis is different. You have to. I really stress American English.
Yeah, I would echo that too. Set your keyboard to American, and that way you have the American grammar on Word and so forth. It really helps because, in my case at least, I am submitting primarily to American markets. When I submit to UK markets, I actually do run a few checks there, and I've actually had one short story where I published an American version and a UK version. And they were different in the grammar. There was shall instead of should, and a few little touches like that, as well as some explanation about the American prison system as well. So you need to be sensitive to what market you are sending it to.
I would agree with that. And I love everything you guys said. Dreyer's English, in addition to being an excellent style guide, kind of like interpreter, is hilarious, by the way. I never thought I'd laugh so much when I was reading a book about grammar. for myself, I'm going to be the slightly dissenting voice, and I'm going to make this caveat that I have not sold nearly as broadly as Holly or Jonas have, but I have up until now made the decision to write for Canadian audience. So my books do have Canadian spelling in them, but I edit American English, I edit Canadian English. Right now I'm in the middle of a project for a UK person. So I have a whole desk full of style guides here. I also write for a magazine. So that's another style guide that's not quite AP, but it's kind of like an in-house style guide. So we're going to be talking more about style guides in a minute, but you just, as Holly said, you really need to be aware of who your audience is. And so I would say before I became an editor, my go-tos were websites like Grammar Girl as well, and a couple of other ones. There's a British Stack Exchange, I think, is one where it would help. And Canadian, if you do want to write in Canadian style, and I mean, it's not that hard to get the Canadian style guide, but there's also an excellent website for Canadian style as well. So it depends what you're doing. If you're doing academic work and you're writing in a Canadian university or something, you're going to have a completely different set of standards than to somebody who's writing fiction. Okay. I think that answered the question. So my go-to tools are style guides now. I wish I would have started picking them up a lot sooner, and I still check them all the time. Okay, so since we're talking about style guides already, I'm just going to mention quickly some of the ones I have on my desk, and Jonas has already mentioned a couple, and you guys can say if there's anything else you use. I use the Chicago Manual of Style as a guide for all fiction, and that's kind of the basis. It's kind of like the generally accepted standard in North America is the Chicago Manual of Style. If you're writing for Canadian audiences, there's a book called, I think it's called Editing Canadian English. Sorry, I did not check that out ahead of time to double check. And it's kind of based on the Chicago Manual of Style with some differences, right? So you kind of need to have them both. And then I'm just going to stick with those two. But honestly, the first thing you want to check is usually the dictionary. And you need to have a dictionary that's accepted by your publisher or whatever you choose to use as your standard. And you can learn so much just by going there first and then other places. All right, Holly, do you have anything to add to that about style guides?
The problem I find with style guides, any of them, is that you need to know what you don't know. And sometimes you're just like, well, that doesn't look right. I don't even know what that thing is. Is it a conjunction or what is it? So how do you look it up? So in that case, I do rely on my critique buddies, and if an editor were to point something out to me, then I would certainly go and look in the style guides, because then I know what I'm looking for. But to learn how to access through the style guides, I find that quite a challenge. And I believe, maybe Talena, you can answer this, but I believe that the Chicago Manual of Style has a fee attached to it. So for most writers, most of the time, they may not want to be paying that fee, although I think there's a small free component. I'm not sure.
So you can get access to the online Chicago Manual Style, which is super awesome for searchability. And yes, there is an annual fee. You can sometimes get that discounted or waived if you're part of a professional organization that has a membership. But you can also just get the book. This is the 17th edition right here. And as you can see, it's hefty. So it's worth all the money you pay for the book. But once you have it, you have it. And yes, there are some standards that are updated every single year. But for the most part, it's going to be just fine for years to come. So, and what you were saying about not knowing what you don't know, I agree. That's why the first thing I usually do if I come up against something is I go to the dictionary and I say, what part of speech is this? And just knowing that part of speech then enables me to go to the index on the CMOS and look that up. And then I can usually start to figure it out from there. Carol, do you have something to add?
Well, what I would add is, because I use the different manuals of style that you've mentioned, but it's also to keep your own style guide for some of the conventions that you've decided for this piece of work or for your writing, so that you can keep track of where did you find certain rules, what conventions are you going to follow, so you can be consistent because consistency is key. And when we start talking about breaking some of the rules, you can break some, but consistently.
I agree 100%. Jonas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that many of the top guides have been mentioned. I also have a hardcover copy of Chicago 17, and I love its searchability and so on. And I totally agree with you, Talena, that once you have a copy of it, you're good for several years. And maybe when it's volume 20, I'll buy a new one. But I think it cost me nearly $80 Canadian to get that one. I can't quite remember the cost of it, but once you do the one cost, you've got it. The website does have a fee, I think, too, but I'm not too sure because I just used the book. And then, but one last thing I want to say is, outside of the guides that I've read, like Grammar Girls and Dreyer's English and a few others, I'll often do what Holly was saying, is I'll often, so I think maybe in addition to what Holly was saying, is I'll often just Google it. And what I mean by that is, does judgment have an E, or do we get rid of the E and add just meant at the end? So I was like, oh wait, is it got an E or not? So I'll quickly do judgment versus judgment, and I'll put the two, one, spell. I'll do the verses all the time. If you ever need a sentence versus another sentence, anything versus, I always get my answers in Google, and it usually sends me to a dictionary, or it sends me to Grammar Girl, or it sends me to these places. So I can often get, and then I learn that judgment without the E is American English. Judgment with the E is Canadian. And I only write in American, so I kill the E. So I've learned these things through just Googling them a lot of the times too.
Yeah, Google is amazing. I don't know what we would do without it, basically. Okay, so so we have these rules, we have these style preferences, and yes, our in-house style guides, and consistency is key. Thank you, Carol, for saying that. Consistency is king, and there are things that basically are almost personal preference. Like, especially if you are writing in Canadian English, sometimes we kind of go either way. It's like, well, you could go with the British way, you could go with the American way. The main thing is to be consistent. Now, there's some things that are hotly debated among the writing community, like the Oxford or series comma. I have to say, I ask every single client that before I ever touch their manuscript. What do you want me to do here? But there are other things, too, that are less well-known. So what do you do when you have something like this? How do you decide what you want to go with? And what if you hire an editor or assigned an editor who hotly disagrees with you? Holly.
In short fiction, you're not often edited terribly much, not as much as novels. So my answer might be a little bit different here than Jonas's or Carol's will be, or yours. Really, for me, what it comes down to is voice. I will push back if I think that it's within the voice of the story, even though I might even know it's not grammatical. And I can think of a few examples where clearly an author may have pushed back against the editor. Look at Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where the dialogue is not in quotation marks. And I find it highly annoying, and I want to throw the book across the room. But it made him distinctive, and it may have added to his sales. Who knows? And he chose that quite deliberately. He knows the rules, right? Know them before you break them. And he went with that, and the editor agreed. For me, the times I've pushed back, it's mostly been within dialogue, where the character does speak that way, and I don't care that it's not grammatical. Another case is I've recently sold a story to Analog. It'll be coming out in the new year. And the title is a sentence fragment. It doesn't sound right. Maybe when we talk about sentence fragments, I'll tell you what the title is. But I'm sure in the slush pile, it got sort of a curious glance because it just doesn't look right. So sometimes you just got to go with your gut.
Yes, Jennifer.
We have a question about what software programs might be on your list that you recommend to have all your writing, like Pro Writing Aid or Grammarly or anything like that.
Okay.
I'll answer that one. I don't want to pay for anything. I'm cheap. Short stories don't pay much. So I go with the free ones. And the one I come back to time and time again is Smart Edit by Bad Wolf Software. Occasionally there's a free version that they throw out there once in a while. Otherwise, I think it's $10 or something. And that one will pick up not only on the grammar, but it picks up on cliches or where you've repeated a word. If the person is wearing a red jacket walking through a red forest and driving a red car, it'll flag all 3 uses of the word red and say, maybe you want to change one of those. So I find it very, very useful. That's Smart Edit by Bad Wolf Software. And otherwise, I sort of take a look at what word is suggesting and see whether they're right or not.
Okay. All right. Carol, if you wanted to respond to that as well, you could. And then also to the question about what if you disagree with an editor or how you decide?
Yeah, I think with the editor and with some of the things and some of what I found, what sticks out to me sometimes in a manuscript can be when a person has written an Eastern European character and they're going with a dialect and they're trying to make them sound Eastern European. And the stereotypical way they try and write that isn't how a person from Eastern Europe would be talking if they're living in America or in Canada. And they've narrowed in. And so because I'm Eastern European ancestry and around a lot of people who have immigrated, and you hear how their language is and how it evolves the longer they're in Canada, those things, when I read that, it jumps out at me. And just with what Holly said about I was like, oh, I'm going to mention about the quotation marks and no quotation marks, because that is one area where people are strongly one way or the other. And if they see your writing and you haven't used quotation marks, then you must use quotation marks. And so it's being aware of what is a almost like controversial choice that may make some people decide to read it or not, or comment on it. But and as far as software, I don't have any of those paid programs at this point. I work in Scrivener and also in Word. So I will look at what Word suggests on the grammar check and see, is there something there that I need to change? And I liked what had been mentioned, what Talena had said about looking up what part of speech is this and using that as a way into the thick grammar books and to find what do I look at? Where do I look?
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jonas, anything to add there?
Yeah, just quickly, I also use Scrivener. I write in Scrivener, but when I'm also an editor, and so when I get editing projects, they come in Word. So I edit in Word, but I only ever write in Scrivener, and I edit my own work in Scrivener. I have seen the benefits of using Grammarly. I've never used it myself, but I have a writer in my life that is using Grammarly, and I have seen how she uses it, and it's very helpful. So I would actually recommend Grammarly. It also, as Holly mentioned, the word red and how it causes what I call an echo, an unnecessary echo, and will often throw the reader out when they're reading the word red 3 times in 2 sentences. So Grammarly picks up those kinds of things and even says, consider revising. So Grammarly, I recommend there. Back to the editor comment about even Talena's comment about the serial comma. For me, as an editor, also as a writer, I research those things to death. And after researching the Oxford comma, also known as a serial comma, after researching it, I understand that it is a must. From 20 sources, I have found that only a couple said you can choose to or not. So and they've argued their points both ways. And so I always do it. I always add it if I don't see it. And the author has an option to reject my edit, but I add it because, and I can give many examples of how it will actually change the sentence without it and cause confusion without it. So I can cite examples when I'm doing my editing. So things like the Oxford comma, I totally recommend it. But last point I want to make about the Cormac McCarthy and the quotation marks, I love The Road. It was an incredible book. Cormac hardly ever uses quotation marks. And well said, Devin. Devin just popped in with a comment. But I recommend if you're writing your first or your second book and you're relatively unknown, I recommend you stick to as many as the rules as you can. Use quotation marks. Don't try to be a Cormac on your first book because you're too much of an outlier in the beginning. Wait until you've got a name. You've written 7, 10, 15 books. You've sold 1 million books for your publisher. Then you can do what you want, is what I would recommend.
I think that's very solid advice. I'm also strongly pro Oxford. Unfortunately, the magazine I write for and just, journalistic style in general does not use the Oxford comma. It took me a good year to not cringe every time I had to go through and edit something before I sent it to my editor and take out all the last commas in the series. I'm just like, oh! Anyway, as far as how to decide what to use, what to not, what you want to keep in mind is you always want to serve the story, and that means serving the reader. So especially if you're not writing something literary, like if you're in genre fiction, you want that to be as accessible to the reader as possible. Anything you do that makes it difficult for them to continue reading is not serving your story. It's not serving your reader. So it's fine to use sentence fragments if that's how people talk. It's fine to use accents sparingly, I would say, and you'll probably hear that from other people as well. But you got to just keep in mind that if you're going to throw in a semicolon 3 times per sentence or something strange like that, or if you're just going to use dashes instead of quotation marks, that is going to be a difficult thing for your reader. I don't know if any of you have ever read, I think it's Huckleberry Finn, and the whole thing is written in dialect. It is so difficult to read, and I liked the book, but it took me probably a good 2-3 chapters to even start to understand what was happening in it. So you just got to make sure that whatever style decisions you make, you're doing it very intentionally, and that it's not going to be something that will be such a problem for your reader that they'll throw your book across the room and never pick it up again. Okay, so speaking of sentence fragments, atypical grammar structures, what are you guys' opinions about that? I guess I kind of preempted that with my own. Holly, let's go to you next.
I'm pro Oxford comma, just for the record. For the reasons that you said, Talena, it's all about clarity. Getting the information through to the reader, and without that comma, it can be so confusing. So the reason to follow the grammar rules is clarity. The reason to maybe break them, as we said, was maybe authenticity in a certain character's way of speaking, or if English is not their first language, and so on. But for me, I will mix it up. I will be more casual, depending on the audience. I do write a lot of young adult, and I make it looser and easier to read. Sentence fragments don't matter. When you're texting, you don't use periods and things like that. Younger readers do read quite differently. They use way more exclamation marks when they're texting, and the texting language is seeping over into written fiction. It is. And I try and be aware of that, and I get my daughter to correct my slang when it's too old-fashioned, and so on. So I'm very conscious of who the audience is as well. Speaking of semicolons, there was a story called Robot by Helena Bell. It was nominated for a Nebula in 2012 for Best Short Story. It didn't win, but it was nominated. And it's a 1,800-word short story. It's not very long, just a few pages. It has 94 semicolons in it. And the reason is it's written as if it was written by a robot, and that's the robot's voice. The robot logic is it goes from logic thought to another logic thought to another logic thought, which is just what a semicolon does. So there's a brilliant use of breaking a rule. And typically in my first draft, I'll have far too many semicolons and I end up taking them out because it does connect related thoughts, but you know, it's not an accepted practice. So I'm conscious that I do need to edit them out and make it 2 sentences or 1 sentence or something. So I guess I'm saying it's a balancing act.
Awesome. Okay. I love that. I'm going to have to go look that story up. All right, Carol.
Yeah, well, I am pro Oxford comma. And it becomes with it's making sure that what you're breaking, what you're doing, serves the story and the character development. Because if it's serving it, it won't be as jarring to the reader. Or if there's a reason you want to jar the reader, but then don't do it every page, every paragraph. Because as you read things and as you read more, there are so many stories out there for people to read. You don't want them to have a reason to put your book down before they're engaged and I want to know what happens next with Sarah in Jonas's books. You know, you want people to care about your character and want to keep turning the pages, because if there's something that some of my friends are voracious readers, they read very quickly a lot of books and they will put books down. Just if there's something that jars. And so your attention span is so short these days for your readers. And and the people will overlook it if you're critically acclaimed and you're on one of the big book award shortlists, then people may overlook that and read the book.
Very true. Jonas?
We have something from Jennifer?
Yeah,
No.
There's a question from attendee.
About M dashes?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I'll jump in on Talena's comment here and add an M dash comment. I really like what you're saying, Holly and Carol, about semicolons and so on. Without drilling this point into the ground, let me just summarize that if you haven't read a book called The Bestseller Code, I recommend it. The Bestseller Code. These people took the top 500, I think it is, the top 500 bestsellers over 10 years, and then took the top 500 books that were written by great authors who were not bestsellers, and they examined them. They examined everything. How many times the word love was used? How many semicolons how many times was the word the used? How many times were words of emotion used? But without getting too off track here, they found that the top 500 bestsellers had no or hardly any semicolons. They had none, exclamation, maybe one exclamation mark. They had no colons. They had no what they called writer tricks. Take them all out. The top 500, Grisham, King, all of them aren't using these things. These are writer's tricks trying to be fancy. This is what the book talks about. So, and I realized that I never use semicolons. As Holly said, you can rewrite the sentence or use a comma or make it 2 sentences. And Holly hit that point dead on. I really believe in that. Yank out all your semicolons, yank out all your colons, get rid of your, I heard one editor once say, an author is allowed 1 exclamation mark per author life. This guy was in New York, a New York editor. They allow 1 per life for an exclamation mark. So when I hear these things, I don't put them in any of my books. And I'm almost at 3 million books sold. And I'm not saying just because of those things that I'm selling books. There are many other reasons I'm selling books. But the point is, as Carol said, my readers aren't looking at all these writer's tricks and getting distracted. They're actually a distraction. So I believe in taking all that out. So the M dashes and the hyphens and the dashes, they're so important, and I really love to use, we're talking about sentence fragments, and I really find that using an M dash will often cause something of a feel of a sentence fragment in the middle of a sentence, and it's just terrific to use. It's a great tool. M dashes had no issue in the, in the bestseller code. They didn't talk about em dashes in any negative way. They recommended with proper use, just don't overuse, actually don't overuse anything. Just write the words, create the story, and bring us along with your journey, and we'll have a great time. But I love em dashes and will often use them. I don't really know how many I use in a book. I've never done that check, but I'm sure I use them a dozen times in a book, and none of the others I'll ever use. So that's important. And sentence fragments, I love them. I use them as often as I can. I believe sentence fragments offer pace. They can create tension. I have many scenes that every scene I have, there's something happening. There's internal, external conflict. There's an emotional stakes. And so using a sentence fragment can just drop you into the, like, what? Wait, what? And then you've got exposition that I use the sentence fragments in too, to keep the reader just jerking into each sentence. And then I'll use a long sentence to vary things up. So I'm a sentence fragment lover.
I love that. And I edit middle grade fiction, and one of my authors, she likes sentence fragments, and I like them, but sometimes I just find them in the wrong places. I'm like, okay, it doesn't make sense here, but this one should be actually. So, okay, so we're getting close to our question time, and we're getting close to the end, and we do have some questions coming in, but we had one kind of important thing in the description I want to cover. And what's the social contract between reader and writer? So if we could each just maybe keep our comments really short, so we do have time to answer our last few questions here before we go on. Holly, sorry.
For me, the contract between reader and writer is what Carol touched on, the attention span. It's a buyer's market, and they will put your book or your story down fairly quickly because there's just too much out there to read right now. Really what you're creating is sort of a conspiracy between you and the reader, in that you're trying to create a fictional world that doesn't exist, and any roadblocks you put up, which can be grammar or anything else, kicks them out of that world, and you need to keep it as immersive as possible. Did you want me to answer the other questions as well there, or?
Sure, or we can come back to it in a minute. Why don't we just talk about the social contract, and we'll come back to these questions, I promise. Okay, Carol, how about you?
Yeah. I think it's to understand the expectations of the genre you're writing in, because that becomes the one of the first parts of the social code. What kind of book is it that they're picking up, and what are their expectations and preconceived notions about it? Especially when you're starting out with your first book. And as Jonas mentioned, follow most of the rules until you're established enough that you can break more. And it's to also keep in mind the contract with the reader is that you're going to immerse them in the story, the action, almost as quickly as you can, so that they know what's at stake, what's happening, there's tension, and some of the other things that you want to have some of these beautiful words in there, or some of these longer scenes, longer descriptions, move those later on and spread them out, because as you get the reader in there and as they're drawn into the story, then you can start adding some of those things in there. But if you open up with just beautiful description of the blade of grass, you can't carry that for many pages.
Absolutely. Jonas?
I think for me, what I do is, this isn't meant to sound rude, but when I write my first draft, I write it for me. I don't think about the reader. I don't think about, I think only about me and the story. And I make sure it works, it's cohesive. I love where Carol mentioned Sarah. I write many Sarah Roberts books. I've got book 24 coming out in 2 weeks. So with Sarah, I just write her. I write what she's doing, what's happening. I have violence, I have crime, racing, chasing, all kinds of fun things, and I'm having a great time with it. And I write the first draft. When I reread it, now I have the reader in mind. Now I have, and especially with a series that's 24 books long, with book 25 coming out in October, with something that long, 300 and 400 page novels, I've really got to remember what Sarah means to these readers. I've got to, and I'm talking from a series point of view, even with my standalones. I've got many standalones, several more coming out next year. I do have to think about some of the reader contract and because there are times when I have written something that I felt was too dark or I shouldn't go there. And I have had to pull back when I was rewriting for the reader, if that makes any sense. It's just so important to make sure that, I don't mean to cheapen anything, but I do think of it as a sales. And what I mean is I have to sell the story, not sell it like buy a book. I'm talking about when people are reading it. Oh, that makes sense. Oh, I like what he did here. I've got to sell those points. And so I don't think of that when I'm writing the first draft. Second, third draft, and so on, completely consider the reader in every scene and every, because now I have the story. So I have something I can play with. I don't edit until I've written the book. And then I edit in all facets.
I love all the different ways we're coming at this. I'm going to just kind of like add on to a couple things there. First, I think whatever you do, you need to do it very intentionally. And as far as like the social contract, one thing that people tend to forget is like, okay, a book might cost it's the same amount as like a snack and a coffee at Starbucks. But when people buy your book, they're not just putting money out, they're actually giving a time commitment because it takes a long time to read a lot of books. And so that social contract is that they're going to give you their time and you're going to give them an excellent product. So you want to make sure that whatever things you intentionally do differently is not something that's going to violate the trust that they put in you just by giving you their time. So for me personally, I am widely read. When I started writing, I really like to have a whole bunch of different things. I just wrote whatever I wanted, and that's why I'm now in 3 different genres. And I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the best way to quickly launch a writing career, what Jonas did, where he just writes thrillers. That's an excellent way to become successful very quickly. You get very good at what you do, and you're going to quickly find an audience. I am just now starting to find my audience for my work 5 years in. And that's in 3 different genres. So they're not the same audience for the most part. Okay. So, the decisions I made about writing with Canadian style, I made that partly after writing just my first book. And I did poll my audience, which was mostly Canadian. Like, do you guys care what style it is? And most of the Canadians were like, we don't care. And some of them were like, we really like Canadian style. And the Americans were the only ones who ever said, we don't like anything but American style. I'm like, you know what? I have hardly any Americans in my audience at the time. In the future, I may make a different decision. Right now, I've got my books in Canadian style. So, you got to decide what you're doing. I break enough. I'm asking a lot of my readers already just because I am so cross genre in everything I write. So I don't want to annoy them with bad grammar or other things like that. So coming back to the grammar thing. Okay, we have only a few minutes. We have a few questions. I'm just going to let whoever wants to speak to them can. Is there a major or very common rule that you prefer to break?
But go ahead, somebody else.
Yeah.
I would say no, because I want to get through the slush pile. I'm careful not to break the big rules, especially if it's an anonymous slush pile. Having said that, the one I break is the one you just touched on, Talena, about I'm going to have a Canadian flavor and Canadian influence and probably Canadian grammar, because that's part of my agenda, even though it might make it harder in the slush pile.
Right. Carol, do you have anything on that?
With that, how I satisfy my Canadianisms in my writing is I was born in Saskatchewan. So I will introduce bunny hug when I can. I will introduce some of the Saskatchewan words. And that's how I will take care of do I write in the American English or Canadian English?
Okay. I like comma splices on occasion in dialogue. That's one of my rules. I know I've got a few other ones, but that's one of them. Okay, what is your preferred method of writing character thoughts, i.e. italics, using he, she, thought, and which do you find more effective? Before I pass this off, I'm just going to quickly say that my preferred method is to see italics for direct thoughts, but I have read all kinds. If you write it without italics, great, as long as it's clear what it is. Anyone else want to add on that?
Quickly, I'll just say, Dreyer says avoid italics as often as possible. They get annoying when overused. And so I have stopped using italics for interior thought. And also there's redundancies. A lot of times you'll have italics and then have John thought. You don't need the John thought. If it goes into italics, we know he's thinking interior thought. But if you do want to avoid italics, which I do now, I avoid it at all costs. Because the new rules in New York, I almost said Hollywood, the new rules in New York are avoid italics at all costs. So I have only the words that are emphasized, like you will not get in that car. You know, the word not will be italicized to make sure there's a punch on it. But that's really the only time I use it now, because the common rules are get italics out of your books. So for interior thought, I don't use it anymore. I don't recommend it.
And I think your audience too makes a difference. Like if you're writing historical romance, for instance, those readers are probably more used to seeing italics and they would maybe prefer it. Like part of my problem when I first started was that I'd mostly read classics my whole life. I had no idea what modern writing standards were. You write thrillers, so that non-italic thought would be really direct. Do we have a couple more minutes? Can we go over? We gotta be wrapping up. I think that's all of our questions anyways. Do you guys want to say anything else? And if not, just tell us where to find you online so people can buy your books. Holly?
I just want to say keep on writing and don't worry about the grammar. It'll all come together in the end. You can find me at hollyschofield.wordpress.com. Thank you.
Awesome. Carol?
Yeah, I'll have a website coming out soon. I think it's going to be www.carolparchewsky or caparchewsky.com. And comma splice, I have too many when I write my first pass. So I'm happy when I have a clean pass where I don't have comma splices. And yeah, it just becomes use the resources, keep writing. As far as thought tags, I've been writing in a close point of view. So then I'm so close in my point of view that I don't need the thought tags or the italics. It's clear when it's a thought.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol. Jonas?
I'm Jonas Saul. You can, anytime you Google my name, jonassaul.com, you'll find everything you need. Amazon author page and several author pages. BookBub is a great place to find everything with me. And I wanted to thank everyone who watched too, and all the comments. That was wonderful to see such interaction.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I'm also at talenawinters.com. If you can't remember how to spell my name, you can also find me at mysecretwhitewishpublishing.com. It'll go to the same place. And yeah, you can buy direct from my website there as well. And thank you everyone for the great, for coming and for the great discussion, you guys. It was really good to see you. And I hope you all have an awesome WWC.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. Just a reminder, this is recorded, so after everything's uploaded, you'll be able to find all of the panels online for the review.
Perfect. Thank you so much. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.